life. You know, go to any fast food restaurant and you're going to get this question: is it for here or to go? Because it can't be for both. Either you're staying or you're going. Which one is it? Well, you know, when it comes to the church, we're going to have to answer the same question when it comes to the gospel. Is it for here or there? Is it one or two? Are you staying or are you going? Only the difference is in the church, it's not one or the other, it's yes. The answer is yes. It's both. You know, when Jesus in Acts chapter 1 verse 8 said that, and you will be my witnesses to his disciples, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, that really does become an outline to the book of Acts. In Acts chapters 1 through 7, we see the gospel going to Jerusalem, starting with Peter. And then in Acts chapters 8 through 12, we see the gospel going to all of Judea and Samaria, beginning with Philip. And then when we get to Acts chapters 13 to 28, we see the gospel going to the ends of the earth through Paul and through Barnabas. And that's where we come to today. We come to this text, Acts chapter 13, which really is a turning point in the history of the church. Because up to this point, the church really had been saying the gospel's for here. The gospel's for here. I mean, even when the church was persecuted and scattered, the gospel was wherever they were. It's for here. But here in Acts chapter 13, we have a church in Antioch strategically, intentionally, and purposefully saying, hey, the gospel's not just for here. The gospel's for there. Is it for here or there? And this church says, yes, it's both. And this church sets apart Saul and Barnabas. In fact, right here in chapter 13 is where Saul's name gets changed to Paul. And so we have Paul and Barnabas being set apart to go and to intentionally take the gospel to the world. I love this church in Antioch because it's not just about here, it's there. Now, they also were about taking the gospel here, you know, welcoming people here, because in chapter 11, we see that there were two guys that took the gospel to the Greeks there in Antioch, Greek-speaking Jews, and they shared the gospel with them as well. I mean, this church truly was about taking the gospel both here and there. And that really is what Jesus commissioned us to do. You know, when you look at Jesus' last words, and usually last words are pretty important. There in the Great Commission, Jesus said, go and make disciples. And when he said go and make disciples, the word or the phrase there literally means just as you're going, make disciples. As you go, make disciples. And so that really is for here. I mean, as you're going to work, as you're going to school, as you're going through your day, make disciples. But when he adds of all nations, Jesus demonstrates the gospel is both for here and there, that we are also to go. That's why here at Northside Christian Church, we have on our global outreach wall in our lobby the 4 practices of global outreach. And those practices are, first of all, is to go. It's going. Because here in Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas, they go and take the gospel. We also are committed to the practice of welcoming, because we see that in the early church, and we see it here in this church in Antioch, like in chapter 11, where they welcome those who are different from them, but they welcome them to share the gospel with them. We also are committed to the practice of sending, because here we have a church in Acts 13 that we want to be like this church of Antioch, where they commission 2 men, Saul and Barnabas, to go, and they lay hands on them and they pray over them and they fast for this very purpose. And then we see that we need to be about the practice of mobilizing, where we work together to take the gospel. And what we see as we get into future chapters here in Acts is that Paul and Barnabas come back to the church and report on what God is doing, and together they plan for taking the gospel to other people. And you know, as I look at this purpose of the gospel being for here and there, I'm reminded that there are some pretty significant barriers to that happening. And one of those barriers is probably the most significant barrier. I mean, there's lots of barriers. I mean, we could talk about linguistic barriers. We could talk about cultural barriers, all kinds of things. But the very first barrier to really taking the gospel where it needs to go is probably the most formidable one. It's one that in our Kairos course is really talked about, and it's this one, the reluctance barrier. You know, we have the greatest message. Right here in this chapter, I love verse 38, where the text tells us this. It says, "Therefore, my brothers, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through Him, everyone who believes is justified from everything you cannot be justified from by the law of Moses." We have the forgiveness of sins. Those of us who believe in Jesus, we can be justified from those sins. We have the greatest message, and yet we also have this hesitancy. We have this reluctance to go because of our own insecurities, because we don't want to get out of our comfort zone, because of whatever hindrances we seem to come across. We are just reluctant to do it. It's what led Ralph Winters to say this: why can we seem to see 10 people get saved, but not hardly find one who will be a missionary? And it's because of the reluctance barrier. We're reluctant to go and to get outside of our comfort zones and to be stretched to take the gospel to people who desperately need to hear it. I love this church in Antioch that's willing to send these two men, and I love to see Paul and Barnabas get out of their comfort zones and they go. It is so inspiring to watch. We need to be people who overcome our timidity and our reluctance, and we need to do what Jesus has called us to do and to be willing to go. Have you ever had that moment when you felt led by God to say something or to do something, to share Jesus with somebody, to talk to them about their faith, talk about them about their journey, and then you, because of your own reluctance, you didn't do it? And you knew you should have. In fact, later you've regretted that you didn't. Have you ever felt called by God to go somewhere, maybe even to go on a mission trip, but you just have put it off? May this be the year where you overcome that reluctance and you step out of that comfort zone and you boldly step forward in faith. That is one of the greatest barriers to the gospel being for here and there. It's our own reluctance. I pray that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you would overcome it. There's a second barrier I see here in the text, in Acts 13, and it's this. It's not just reluctance, it's resistance. What we notice right here in Acts chapter 13 is that Paul and Barnabas face resistance everywhere they go. I mean, from the get-go. As soon as they're on mission and they're sent out, they faced resistance. There's the story of a false prophet and sorcerer named Bar-Jesus who resists them. And then there's the jealous Jews who come up against them and resist them. And what I want us to notice here is Paul's response. As you read through the text, you notice that first of all, Paul responds by speaking boldly in the face of resistance. He speaks boldly. And as a result, all the believers, people who are coming to faith, they were filled with joy and they were filled with the Holy Spirit. He just came against resistance with boldness. I love that about Paul, and I'm inspired by that. The second thing I want you to notice about Paul's response to the resistance is that he shifted his focus to those who would be most receptive. It was this Jewish opposition that kicked Paul out of the synagogue. It was this Jewish opposition that resisted him and tried to persuade others to go against him. And what I want you to notice in this text is that Paul does something that typically Jews would do to Gentiles. You see, a Jewish person who walked through a Gentile land would shake the dust off their feet as to say, I don't even want the earth clinging to my sandals that was once in Gentile land. You know, it was defiled, and so they would shake it off their shoes. And Paul turns this on its head, because here he is facing all this opposition from the Jews, and once it occurs, he simply shakes the dust off his feet. He does the very thing that they would do, to say that their opposition of Jesus and their rejection of the gospel. He says, I don't want to be defiled by that. Once he's kicked out of the synagogue, Paul says, okay, I'm now going to shift my focus, my ministry to the Gentiles, which he does. Now, it doesn't mean he doesn't ever share with the Jews again. He does. In fact, he always starts in the synagogues. He starts where Jews would gather, where they would come together. But his primary mission was to those Gentile believers and to those who would be receptive to the good news. As we come to the end of this chapter of 13, there's a question I really want you to think about. And that is, when God gives you an opportunity, because He will, When God gives you an opportunity to talk about Jesus, to talk about the gospel, to talk about your faith and the hope we have in Him, to talk about being saved by grace through faith in Jesus, when God gives you the opportunity, what is your response going to be? Are you going to be reluctant? Are you going to be resistant? Or are you going to acknowledge your tendency towards reluctance and speak boldly by the power of the Holy Spirit, and go to those who would be receptive and open to hearing the gospel? Because what I hear God saying to us through Acts 13 is the gospel's for here and for there. As you're going here and as you're going there, let's take the gospel everywhere we go.